Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Today, I wanted to address the subject of futurism. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. I'm sure some of you have. It is sometimes called futurology, which I think sounds better, but maybe is not the best term. I think futurism is better for reasons that, well, I think become apparent as I discuss this subject. There is an organization called the World Future Society, which is devoted to the subject of futurism. And for years, futurists have tried to become respectable academically. They have never succeeded in that. I can tell you why that is. I know exactly why that is. They have tried, though, many times to gain the respect of academic institutions. I think that many of them would like to even see departments of futurism open up in universities and colleges all over the world. Never happened. Futurism is not an academic subject. Here's why. There is no way to academically predict the future. In effect, what futurism is, without intending to be that, it would appear to me, is simply a sophisticated form of science fiction. Now, if you look, for example, at Star Trek, the various Star Trek series, beginning, of course, with the original Star Trek series in the 1960s, which I did not watch that much because it didn't interest me. Later on, I did go back and I think I've seen all the episodes multiple times, and I've watched most of the series up until uh, Star Trek moved on to the Paramount Network, a streaming service, and I have not had any interest in subscribing to that streaming service. I have other things to do. Maybe at some point I will, but it's not something that I've done yet, and I suspect I won't do it. Maybe, but probably not. Um, the reason why futurism has not been called futurology, in my opinion, is because futurology would make it sound like sociology, anthropology, geology, and so forth. In other words, it would make it sound like a science. I think calling it futurism is more accurate because futurism is not a science, not even close. Um, you can look at Star Trek and many things that we see around us today, like, for example, the cell phone, were anticipated by Star Trek. The old Star Trek communicator, right? That's right there in Star Trek, and it anticipated the cell phone. In fact, the cell phone is more sophisticated than the original communicator in the first series of Star Trek. And there are other things as well. Scientists have long been inspired by science fiction, and that's fine. That's good. If somebody sees something in a science fiction show and they can use it for the betterment of humanity, why not? I don't know whether the cell phone was inspired by the Star Trek communicator at all, but would I be surprised if it was? No, of course not. Certainly, Gene Roddenberry, the guy who developed Star Trek, who was kind of a weird character, and I'll get to that in a second, um, was a person who thought about these things very carefully and was a very smart guy, and he deserves credit for coming up with many ideas which have later formed physical things, later found their realization in things that we use today, like the cell phone, perhaps. But Gene Roddenberry was kind of a nut. He was one of the people who attended this group called the Council of Nine. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. If you've not, you might want to Google it. You can read some of the transcripts of supposed conversations which took place between the attendees or one of the attendees and this supposed Council of Nine. It's really a load of nonsense. It was one of the earliest attempts at what we now call channeling. Channeling itself was really an offshoot of spiritualism, where you would have a medium conducting a seance who would go into a kind of trance and would supposedly then contact your old grandmother. Sorry, I want to see my grandmother someday, maybe, but contacting her through a medium doesn't really appeal much to me. Now, I loved my grandparents, all of them that I knew. One of them I didn't know because he died 20 years, I think, before I was born. But seeing them through a medium, no, that does not seem very appealing to me. That's probably a good word for it. Not very appealing. But what Futurism has tried to do, I think, is to capture the spirit of science fiction. Now, I could be wrong, but that has always been my impression. Science fiction is a very popular genre, both in literature and in cinema, and for good reason. It's very entertaining. My father, especially, I remember when I was growing up, loved science fiction, and he would read practically every science fiction book he could find. Myself, no. I was into Star Trek, the series, and Star Wars to a much lesser extent, the series, and Babylon 5 to a perhaps greater extent, the series, and other shows like Stargate, both the movie and the various series which were inspired by it. So I myself liked science fiction. I still do like it, although admittedly not as much as I did when I was growing up, but I still like it. I mean, it's fun. It's fun speculating on what the future might look like, on portals to other dimensions, on going faster than the speed of light. All these things, they're a lot of fun. Now, will these things ever be possible? I have no idea. I am not a physicist, so I can't claim any special knowledge in that area, and I will not pretend to know something that I don't know, because I know nothing about that area. But I would like that to happen. I mean, it would be great to go past the speed of light. It would be great to instantaneously teleport from one place to another. It seems like magic. Why? Because today it would be magic. We can't do it. That kind of scientific knowledge is not yet, and perhaps never will be, available. I don't know. But when you take basically a literary and later a cinema or cinematic genre like science fiction and transform it into a supposed field of academic study, that simply does not work. I mean, how many departments of science fiction are there? To my knowledge, and I could be wrong, zero. I don't think there are any departments of science fiction. Now, are there courses in science fiction? Yes. How do I know? Because I took one, and it was a lot of fun. We would read science fiction novels, and then we would watch science fiction movies, and we would try to look for comparisons between them. It really was an enjoyable activity. Here's the problem with futurism, or the major problem with futurism. Most of the predictions that have been made over the years by futurists, including those who are in the World Future Society, have failed. And in academia, one thing that we look for is accuracy, reliability, and validity. If you have neither, well, the field itself is discredited. And, so futurism literally has no respectability in academia because it has made so many failed predictions. Now, if there was a way of evaluating a prediction, for example, as we can do in sociology by practicing something called multiple regression, by practicing factor analysis or path analysis, and so on, we can determine the probability that something is likely to happen or that the sample corresponds to the population in more technical terms. But you can't do that in futurism. You just can't. It doesn't work. So futurism is a speculative field. It is really an art and not a science. Now, if futurists had originally proposed futurism as an art, would it have been successful? Maybe, maybe. But I still can't imagine departments of futurism. Maybe you might teach futurism as a part of some larger class or course in art. Maybe, I don't know. But having an artistic department of futurism really makes no sense. And here's the reason why. Because futurism is not set up like an art, right? It's set up like a science. It makes predictions. Artists do not make predictions. They make things. They make sculptures, they make paintings, and so on. They take photographs, but they don't make predictions. Art is fun. It is a creative endeavor. It is something that I personally enjoyed, especially when I was in elementary school. For some reason, the older I got, the less interested in art I became. Not sure exactly why that was, but my interests just shifted into other areas. And I certainly, if I were asked as a kid what I planned to do for a living, I never in a million years would have come up with a sociologist. That never would have even occurred to me. And yet, that is what I am. When I was a kid, I was a ventriloquist. That is an art. It's also fun. It's also kind of passe in a way. Ventriloquism has kind of gone the way of mime and juggling. Mime, juggling, and ventriloquism are novelty acts. And novelty acts are usually not that successful. Now, there was a time when ventriloquism was more popular. Back in the days, for example, of Edgar Bergen, of Paul Winchell, and so forth. Back in those days, ventriloquism, for some reason, was more popular. Why it lost popularity, I don't know, but it did. How many people, how many ventriloquists do you see on late night TV anymore? To my knowledge, none. Maybe there are some occasionally, but if there are, I am unaware of them. So ventriloquism has kind of died out. Same thing is true with mime. When I was a kid, mime was somewhat popular, and certainly mime can be entertaining. There are some people who literally hate mime. I've known people like that. I don't know why. I don't hate it. I think it's a fun thing to watch. I wouldn't want to watch it all the time, but certainly watching it once in a while is a nice thing to do. Juggling, the same thing, especially if people can juggle objects with fire in them. It adds to the suspense of the performance and makes it more interesting to observe. So what I did was an art, but it is an art which sadly has died out. And so, to take a little bit of a tangent, what I have lately been thinking of doing is starting up a new channel separate from this one to do stand-up comedy. I thought initially about reviving my interest in ventriloquism, but then I decided, why would I want to revive something that basically hardly no one does anymore? And ventriloquism is, I mean, as a kid, I liked it. As an almost 68-year-old man, not so much. But comedy might be fun. And I have actually come up with a character. And no, I'm not going to tell you because it's not finalized yet. But I may, and if and when I do come up with that character, I will let you know. But comedy might be fun. Comedy might be a nice sideline to the more serious things that we talk about in this podcast. So, again, futurism, maybe some fun, but scientific, no. I attended one futurist conference. I forget where it was, and I forget which organization sponsored it. Although, if I am correct, it was sponsored by a regional branch of the World Future Society. Okay, I think, but I'm not positive. One of the workshops I attended was visualization. And what we were asked to do was to close our eyes and to visualize the future. Well, I went along with it. We all went along with it. It was really a curiosity more than anything else, I think, for the majority of us who were in there. But if futurism wants to become respectable, you don't hold workshops or seminars in visualization and try to predict the future. There is a name for that. It is called remote viewing, which is a pseudoscience. There are remote viewers all over the place. If you have not seen it, you might want to check it out on YouTube. There are plenty of remote viewing channels, plenty of people who pretend to be remote viewers. This one particular guy whose name I can't remember offhand claimed that the world would end on a certain date. That date was about 15 years ago. Then this other remote viewer claimed that he had discovered the secret to eliminating all diseases. Well, when it was studied, it was found to be completely worthless. So remote viewing is a pseudoscience, meaning it is a false science. It is something which pretends to be science, but in reality is not scientific. Why? Because it does not follow a scientific method. Now, I should point out that contrary to popular usage, there is no such thing as the scientific method. There are many scientific methods. Even in my own field of sociology, we have many different scientific methods. Most of those methods involve some combination of induction and deduction, but they are systematic. And so the idea is that no matter who is doing the study, they should arrive at similar results. Otherwise, it's not science, it's pseudoscience. And so in my field of sociology, we try to be as careful as we can. Sometimes we can't be that careful, especially with more qualitative research, like participant observation or ethnography, where we go into a place and simply observe what other people are doing and participate along with them. So not only are we observing, but we are participating and getting a greater sense of the activity which is taking place. That's not quite as reliable as more quantitative analysis, but it has some degree of reliability. At least some methods of qualitative research are reliable and valid to varying degrees. Futurism? No. Now, does that mean that futurists are never right? No, doesn't mean that at all. But it means that it can't be depended upon. Now, why am I doing a podcast on futurism on this channel? That's a good question. Thank you for asking that, Mark. Well, because I think that as Marxists, or at least speaking for myself, I probably should do that. That's more accurate. As a Marxist, I cannot assume that I know for a certainty what is going to happen. I can't. So I may say that what I believe is that the first world is dying. Why? Because I see it dying. That is not a prediction. That is an observation. We see the first world dying all around us. And as somebody who lives in the first world, it is no fun. I know a lot of people, many of them my friends, who are having horrendous psychological problems. Literally, their lives are falling apart. They are depressed, they are anxious, they are paranoid, and they don't understand why. Well, Marx talked about alienation. And I think that the problems that we are seeing in the world around us are in many ways connected to the tremendous alienation of late capitalism, especially the late capitalism which exists in the first world. So that's, again, that's not a prediction. That is an observation. But if I then turn around and say, well, what I think is that after the first world, I guess, dies, that the third world will pick up the mantle and build communism. That is a prediction. But really what it is, more than a prediction, it is a hope. It is a recognition that the dialectical or revolutionary potential which exists in the first world is minimal. And I cannot imagine how there can be a successful revolution in the United States. If there was going to be such a revolution, I would have thought it would have happened after 9/11, and it did not. Instead, the United States went in the opposite direction. Rather than becoming more radical, more leftist, more revolutionary, the US returned to its default position of being more reactionary. And we went to war, first against Afghanistan, then against Iraq, and now it seems against everyone, or at least we're willing to go to war against everyone. We have made a commitment that we would help Israel, and we are. If it were not for the US, I do not think, from my knowledge, that Israel would be able to successfully wage its war on Gaza. Now, I could be wrong on that, but that's my impression from the stuff that I personally have read. I can't imagine, for example, say President Joe Biden said, stop your war on Gaza. Could Netanyahu continue? I don't think so. The US is the primary supporter of Israel. So without the US, Israel couldn't do anything, or could do very little. Israel has its Iron Dome because of the United States. The United States gave Israel an Iron Dome, but we did not give the same courtesy to Palestine. And so Palestine can be bombed relentlessly. Babies in incubators, I guess, in the views of the Israeli Defense Forces, tiny Hamas members are being killed by Israel, and Palestine is basically a lame duck. It can't do anything. It is powerless. So, okay, so I can see that these things are happening in the world today. I can see that the first world is dying. All I can do is to hope that after there is no more first world, or at least no more first world with undisputed or absolute imperialistic power, that then perhaps, and there is no way of knowing this, because literally by making the statement, I am engaging in futurism or science fiction in a sense, right? That hopefully the third world will eventually take up the mantle of revolution and begin establishing socialism or socialisms in different countries. But that is a hope. That is an aspiration. That is not something that I know. So it's basically saying, well, the first world is cooked. We're cooked. We can't do a thing. So the only thing we can do is to hope that the third world will be able to succeed us. Why? Well, because the third world is oppressed. And often, but not always, oppressed people, when they are conquered, will try to fight back. So far, most of the attempts by the third world to fight back against the first world have failed miserably. The US is the undisputed military leader of the world. Any country that tried to challenge the military of the US would ultimately fail. Now, there would be a lot of deaths. Many of those deaths would, I assume, occur even in the US, but I don't see how any country, especially a country in the third world, in the developing world, would be able to defeat the US. So I think we simply have to wait. We are literally in a waiting game. We are waiting for the first world to, I guess, fall apart. Maybe that's not the best word for it, but it's the only word I can think of because it's what I see. When I read the news on news.google.com, when I watch some commentaries that I like to watch on YouTube, what I see is the end. The end. What I used to call the great unraveling. That great unraveling is occurring, in a sense, throughout the world, but that is because even the third world is dependent upon the first world. So once the first world loses that power, which I think is happening right now, once the first world loses its power to engage in imperialism, in colonialism, and in cultural hegemony, then maybe, and really all that we can say is maybe, because we're not prophets. I know I'm not, and I assume that you're not either. All that we can do is to hope that the third world will succeed the first world and do a much better job than we have. I mean, after all, modern capitalism started in the first world with Adam Smith and then advanced into global capitalism with the shipping industry in the late 19th century, again, primarily in the first world. So capitalism is a first world invention. The capitalist world system is sustained by the activities of the first world. So I think that we can engage in, are you ready for it? Conscientization. We can try to encourage people in the third world to develop a critical conscience and consciousness of their own class positions, and eventually to begin the process leading to communism and to socialism. For the time being, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.